The title of the session is Discovering Our Shared History and ESOL Curriculum, and I just want to give you a little background on it. It started, my students right now, I'm working in a large university. All of my students are employees of the university. I have various classes, but the class I'm focusing on right now is a class that is all adult. All of my students in this class were custodians at this university. They're all from Central America, from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and they're all settled in the U.S. They've all lived here for quite a while. They have families, homes, and obviously employment. And they all have interrupted formal education. So in this class, I'm developing literacy skills and communication skills, so they might have some oral skills. In the fall, we worked in terms of our content. We decided to do a lot of work on U.S. history. Now, our location is Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we had some great historical monuments right around town that we could talk about and that students could recognize in their own environment. We covered in the fall the 13 colonies, the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, some of the battles that occurred here in Massachusetts, and also actually the history of our own university and during that era. And it was quite exciting for them to recognize history and where they're living. But then we had a break, and we have a winter break as a university. We have winter breaks in January, and January 27th was the day that President Trump issued the executive order for a travel ban. And so when we had our first class on the 31st, it was just 4 days after, and there was a lot of confusion and upset. I brought in an article about refugees and the travel ban from News ELA, which is a terrific website that gives various levels of readings, authentic readings, but at various reading levels. Their lowest level does not represent our lowest level, so I took the material and simplified it further. But in bringing that to class, what I uncovered were all sorts of very basic questions, like who are the refugees, where are their countries, why are they leaving, and what is a refugee status? I haven't heard about that. And I realized in that moment that my students all shared pretty much a narrative about their own immigration journeys, but that they hadn't heard other narratives. And so I decided, maybe what we should do is instead of just teaching U.S. history, I could actually teach the history of U.S. immigration. So we started a new curriculum. It took me a couple of weeks to pull materials together. And what I want to do today is basically share this curriculum with you. I'm going to give you a spotlight on a couple of different pieces so you can see what we put together. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to a slide that has a video. I found this, I rooted around, as I said, for a couple of weeks to find materials. This particular video I like for many reasons. Now I need to explain to you before you start to watch it that the video uses a globe. It's really like an animated timeline and map of immigration waves coming to the United States. And to our participants in Alaska and Hawaii, I'm sorry that it actually really focuses on the 48, the continental 48, in terms of arrivals of immigrants. I think that was a slight oversight on their part. But anyhow, this video I found very useful as an overview of thinking about different waves of immigration in the U.S., and it ended up kind of being an outline for the work that I did with my students. I took many screenshots, some of which you can see on the screen here, and those, we would study them in terms of the numbers and the story that they were telling, and looking at the globe and seeing the trajectory across the ocean or through the land. So it gave us a grounding to develop some numeracy skills, map reading skills, and it also gave us something, a touch point to come back to again and again. And then we would do other readings and look at other material. So Denzel, can we play that video now? And it's a 3-minute, 45-second video. We can all just stop, watch it through, and then I'll show you how I dealt with that material. So that was a full overview of the points that we touched on in our curriculum. I chose that for many reasons, because of the map, because of the timeline, and also because it included immigrant groups or groups of people that have not always been included in our story of U.S. immigration. I think when we tend to think about the history of U.S. immigration, we tend to think about Ellis Island. And this video gave a much broader perspective. I'm going to show you now the outline that I created over the 10 weeks. We started with the Native Americans. We did not talk about their approach, the migration of humanity from Africa and through the world, but we started with their presence here, and we moved to talk about the Spanish, and then the early English, and then forced African migration up through Europeans onward. So I'm going to show you just some little tidbits so you get a sense of what we were doing, what we were talking about. Each time we had a topic, we would basically have these 5 questions, of each wave of immigrants. Who were these immigrants? Where did they come from? Why did they leave their homes? And what did they come to find? So what was pushing them and what was pulling them? And then what was life like for them in the U.S. at that time? We started with the Native Americans, and this is just to give you an example of the kind of graphics I was able to bring in that was very exciting for the students to learn how to read different kinds of use of maps. And so I'll read this aloud to you just so we can follow along. So Native Americans lived in North America for thousands of years before other people arrived. There were 11 large groups of Native Americans. In each group, there were many different tribes. Each tribe had its own language and way of life. In this map, we just try to recognize the geography of the United States and also some of the names. Some of these names we've inherited in how we name our country, the United States, now. Also, students would recognize the name of culture such as the Aztecs. So this was our first foray. Then we went into the Spanish. We talked a lot. We spent a lot of time on the map and understanding what's a continent, what's a country, and we talked a lot about Europe. And so here they located Spain and they located Portugal, and then they looked at the kind of settlement that occurred in about 500 years ago. So here I talk about Christopher Columbus, 1942. The Spanish quickly took control of South and Central America. They had territory in North America from 1560 to 1830. And they lived in the area of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The Spanish founded many towns, including San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. So this was a chance for us to see, oh, here's another naming tradition. There's another group of people who came in and gave names to the land that we share and live with together today. The next I talked about actually were not the African slaves. We talked about the Pilgrims and the English coming to the Northeast. Now, as you know, I'm in the Northeast, so that story, that narrative is dominant here, and I think it's also dominant in our history books. But we're able to draw on incredible number of resources. There's a reenactment museum here. There are many, many wonderful resources to talk about the imprint of the Pilgrims and the English in this area. But after we talked about that, at the same time, this was a time of migration, forced migration from Africa. And it gave us an opportunity to bring the story of African Americans into our understanding of how we come from many, many different places. So we talked about the history of their migration, their slavery, And it's interesting, a lot of my students don't really understand the history of slavery in the United States. And so I've tried to find many different ways to bring it in so that they understand part of who we are as a nation and part of our legacy. Here there are a couple points that are very interesting. In number 2, in 1680, there were 7,000 African slaves in the American colonies. The number of African slaves grew to 760,000 by 1790. So the presence of Africans were really part of the early formation of the United States, before it even formed into a nation. Then we talked about, this is a lovely graphic that we use that we talked about, is who lived in the 13 colonies. And maybe, I hope you can see the different colors here. But along with Dutch and English and German and Scottish, they mention also the Africans' presence in the 13 colonies. So again, it was a way to kind of recognize a little bit more about our history. Then we talked about other populations, but this was new for us being in the Northeast. We haven't heard as much about Asian migration and Chinese migration into California. So we talked about the gold rush. The students were fascinated with the gold rush and that kind of notion of there's gold in these mountains and people can go find it. So we looked at how people were living, how they set up their camps, how they looked for gold. And then we talked about the Chinese migration and their search for gold in the gold rush. And here again, you can see point number 2, the Chinese called the U.S. Gold Mountain. And in 1849, there were about 300 Chinese in California. 3 years later, there were 20,000. And almost immediately, not immediately, before even all the 20,000 got there, there were special taxations and other kind of barriers set up for the Chinese. When the gold mine stopped really kind of revealing any more gold, the Chinese moved on to construction sites and other parts and settled into the culture in San Francisco. But then there was the Exclusion Act. And really, that was also, I think, a shock to many of our students about how much Asians have been marginalized not included in our culture and not included in citizenship, but also marginalized in the history of immigration. And then we talked about the Irish. Now here, I live in Boston, right? Boston's a really strong Irish community, and many of my students work with other Irish. So we had a really interesting conversation to understand. It was a great exploration for students to better understand some of the narrative in which they're living right now. We talked about what happened in Ireland. We looked at pictures of the land. We looked at its geography. And we talked about life, especially in the 19th century during the famine. I also brought in illustrations like this illustration I thought was particularly powerful. This is the woman in white. We would just look at it first and they would tell me what they see. They'd see a dilapidated house in the distance. They'd see a boat. They'd see elderly people who are very sad. And then this woman who's holding a record of the people that she's lost. And she is Erin. She is kind of the embodiment, the symbol of Ireland. And so this really helped my students understand better their colleagues' backgrounds and histories. And they found this unit particularly helpful for them. We also listened to some music and brought in some of the arts. All of the immigrant stories are particularly rich in the music and the painting and other expressions of their story. So it's pretty easy to find these materials. This is a classic Irish tune, Celtic tune, but I like the way this man sang it because he sang it very slowly. So could you cue it up and actually just cue it to second 45 so we skip the beginning interlude? I see here that other people have used ballads. and Appalachian ballads as well. In this, and actually the song as well. This song, he goes on to explain why they left, and they left because the sheriff, well, they couldn't pay their landowner the rent, and they couldn't pay the taxes, and eventually they were actually burned out of their home and expelled, and so they came to the U.S. where they could live. It's a powerful, powerful song. Long and heartbreaking, and my students really connected with it, and also the aesthetic of the music, as my students are Latino and they have a strong musical tradition that's very different in sound. So this was another way of connecting them to other narratives and stories. I also see in the chat line here that about the importance of talking about indentured servants. And yes, we talked about that a lot. And that was an interesting stereotype my students had, that Europeans never were always rich and always came here under, with a sense of control of their destiny. And so we talked about indentured servants as well. I just wanted to highlight some other parts of the curriculum. Another part of the curriculum is that we interviewed recent immigrants. We interviewed each other. We would, as a whole class, be together. One student would sit up front, or in our circle actually, and the students would interview the one student, and I would write the student's answer on the board, and then we would read the story. The student would read the story aloud to everyone, and then we'd play with the language and do some language practice with that. I would create closes and dictations and everything from the words the student gave. We also invited staff from our program. We invited all sorts of people in to tell their stories. We also asked people to come to tell their migration stories, and maybe they didn't immigrate from another country, but they came here, and what they expected, and what was hard and what's been good. Now I know Julie Mann and Elizabeth Bendita are going to speak more about telling stories, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. I don't feel like this piece of our of the curriculum was as strong as it could have been. I meet my students for 4 hours a week. And so just enough to get them content and connect them and follow their interests through the waves of migration was about all we really developed. But I will show you one slide here. This is Alex and his story and what he told us when we interviewed him, and I wrote the words on the board. There is, I think, what Julie was talking about the difficulty of violence in their homeland. I mean, in Alex's story, there was violence, but there was also poverty, and he came really to make money. But now in El Salvador, he can't go back. And so there was conversation about that. If I were to do this again, I hope to, I would like to add more. I had some pieces about the history of policy towards immigrants, like in the early days, how people became citizens, who could become a citizen. And we talked about that a little bit. And then we talked about Ellis Island and how people passed through that processing plant, and then how they got, a gateway to be legitimately in the United States. And there are a lot of really difficult feelings around how hard it is now for immigrants to be here, show up, be good members of society, and be accepted for permanent status. And that's something I would like to develop more. All of these materials I'm hoping to develop more because I think they're really helpful for enlarging students' frame and understanding our stories. What did the students learn? I think they learned about geography, about U.S. history. They learned about other American stories, and that was probably the most important impact that this curriculum had for them. They deepened their understanding of their colleagues and of their neighbors and of this area. And they also developed their skills, their literacy, numeracy, visual literacy skills. There was a slide that did not come up in the very beginning, but it was really the slide about my objectives for this course. My objective was for students to broaden their understanding of the history of the United States and to broaden to be able to place their narratives in the frame of a broader story, our story, the story of the United States. And I really do feel that those objectives, along with teaching history and some good skills, were met by this curriculum. I'm really excited about it, and I would like to share it with you. I'd like you to be able to use parts of it. I don't have any, I didn't always trace my citing resources and such because I didn't really think I'd ever be sharing it nationally, but I will be putting up my material onto the Dropbox. And just for you to think about for your situation, of course, you live in different areas, you have different ways of my immigration probably affected your area in other ways. So I think, I just encourage you to look around. You can simplify text. You saw the readings. They can be 6 sentences, very simple text. Illustrations, cartoons, there's incredible historical documentation, photographs. People can interview really anybody about their immigrant heritage, if not their own journeys. And there are also like this video, which I felt worked well, and then, music, Essence Skibbereen. So this is what I wanted to share with you.
Hi, Sarah. That was fascinating. We don't have time to do chat rooms, unfortunately. But perhaps I could just ask you 1 or 2 questions. It's such an interesting curriculum. It covers so many different areas. And one of the things I like most about it is that, as you said, they learn about other Americans' immigration histories. And I don't know if you recall a few years ago when you came to my session at COABE, we had the big immigration timeline on the wall, and we have attendees place themselves not just where they came from, but why. And this is from the 1600s all the way up to now. And part of the reason for that was to emphasize that the reasons people migrated or were forced to migrate back then are not much different to reasons people migrate now. And there's that commonality that people seem to forget. I can imagine that for U.S.-born students, it's a tremendous learning experience for them as well, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I think you could use this in the class in which everybody, you have both native-born and non-native-born, or even just native-born students. I think it really is our history, and it's just a different lens to look at U.S. history. And there's just so much art and expression and connection to it. I think it really could be a rich discovery for any class.
And just one little question.
Yes.
You deal with low literacy adults.
Yes.
Have you thought of any other ideas for different literacy levels or different age groups where this might need to be tweaked?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, I think actually if you look for immigrant stories online, you'll find a lot of material that's higher level. That was part of my struggle, was to how to bring the content down to a first to second grade reading level. But if you look, K-12 orientation, I think a lot of the links that have already been put up, and also links like the Ellis Island link, there are troves of information and really, really good stuff for reading levels 5 through 7. Terrific material. It was much more the struggle to bring it down to a literacy learner who's an adult as well.
So we look forward to getting that on the Dropbox sometime in the future, and everyone is going to grab it up, so get your copyright on that. Thank you so much, Sarah Lynn from Somerville, Massachusetts. This was wonderful. So glad you could join us this year.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Denzel.